You're watching the Flourishing Introvert show. If you're an introvert with more to offer and are looking for ways to play to your strengths authentically, you're in the right place. With up to 50% of any population identifying as an introvert, if you're not one, you'll know one, but you may not understand what makes them tick. Watching this show will help you to build that understanding and consequently build better business and personal relationships. Many people don't find out until their mid-years that what makes them different is their introversion. So this show is also for you if you're curious about becoming the best version of yourself. Let's get started. Hello and welcome back. Welcome back to the Flourishing Introvert show. I'm Jo Rawbone and I want to invite you in. Come in, make yourself comfy. Because after all, we know that introverts are not antisocial. We're selectively social. And you look like an okay bunch. So come on in. Now, in the first show, we actually explored the difference between extroversion and introversion. And what we realized is that it's down to where we get our energy from and what drains, therefore, and what charges our mental batteries. We know that introverts are already overstimulated mentally, and extroverts need that external, additional stimulation. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is playing to your strengths as an introvert, because there's so much more to it than just either being an extrovert or an introvert. You see, we're not all the same. You knew that already, of course you did. There are 6 pure types of introverts and many, many blends. So that's one of the things that we're going to explore today. A lot of people realize that they're an introvert when they first complete the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So when they complete that profile that helps them for the first time, perhaps see that there's nothing wrong with them, that they're not broken, they're not in need of fixing, they're just an introvert. And yet what we need to do is understand how we can make the most of that introversion in a world that is frankly biased against us. It's biased towards extroverts and extrovert behavior. Some of you may have come across the phrase ambivert before, and you might be thinking, well, maybe I'm an ambivert. Well, it's interesting because technically an ambivert is someone who equally draws their strengths from being with people, anybody, and in that busy, loud, noisy environment with all the stimulation, and equally from being on their own. And there are very few people who are equally charged that way. There are a few, but not as many as we think. It became quite popular to class ourselves as ambiverts. But actually, one of the things that I found through my research is that they are far fewer than we think, because actually there are just these different types of introverts. So one of the things that we're going to do today is to explore those 6 different types. And I'll tell you at the end how you can find out what your introvert type is. So let's start with the classic introvert. Now, the classic introvert is almost everything we would imagine an introvert to be. Almost, let's think of the stereotype of an introvert. So someone who really prefers their own company. They're a thoughtful observer. And as I'm going through these points, you might be able to detect which type you are. But more importantly, I want us to start, thinking about what's the strengths that comes with that. So for somebody who's a thoughtful observer, one of the things they're going to do is notice what's going on around them. So they may not be using a lot of air time, but they'll certainly be noticing everything that's going on around. Most introverts, especially the classic introvert, is conflict averse. They will do everything they can to avoid conflict. And that's one of the reasons why they'll often stay out of the way. And they won't get involved in some of the chitty chatty stuff that goes on around the workplace. They won't get involved in some of those conversations that don't seem to be going anywhere positive. They're also very calm and reserved. One of the words that's been used about me in the past is I'm very measured. And my pace of delivery is slower. As you'll notice, I often start off a little bit nervous, but I settle in. But equally, what there is that calm reserve, which means that we diffuse conflict. When there's conflict around us, our calmness allows us to diffuse that conflict that might be around. We're also very resourceful and independent. So we don't take a lot of the boss's time. We're not needy in that sense. And finally, from my list here, because we have a small select group of friends, often classic introvert can count their friends on one hand. They're loyal friends. So you can share secrets with them and they won't go gossiping about it because frankly, they don't have many people that they would gossip with and they don't enjoy gossip in the first place. There are other things we know about classic introverts, that they tend not to enjoy networking events or large parties because they find small talk difficult. So they'll often just get on well with one person in situations like that, but they really don't want to be around lots of people. They will, to save themselves from conflict, will often accept an invitation to a party, a gathering, a meeting, something, possibly with no intention of attending. They're very selective who they share their thoughts with, and they can't always find the right words. Remember, as introverts, we have that think, say, think communication process. So sometimes we can't find the right words. I think one of the typical things of a classic introvert is that they self-censor. There's so many wonderful, rich thoughts going on in their minds that they can't possibly share them all. And so they self-censor, which means that when they do contribute, it's very succinct. Sometimes too succinct. But you know, we need more people to be listening and less people talking. So that's given us a little bit of a feel about our classic introverts. And these are people that are around us everywhere. Remember, up to 50% of any population identifies as an introvert. So what we have are many people who are classic introverts that may get classed as shy, that may get classed as arrogant, some of those myths that we looked at in the first show. Not so. What they are potentially is a classic introvert. We then come on to the next type of introvert. Now, all of the ones that I'm going to cover now, the next 5 types, all have access to extroverted type behaviors, but without their batteries draining quite so quickly. So these are what we class as the extroverted introverts. And this is where many people get confused with, oh, I'm an ambivert. Chances are you're not. Chances are you're either an extroverted introvert or even an introverted extrovert. So let's spend a couple of moments just looking at the connected introvert. As the little diagram shows you, the kind of icon for the connected introvert. Connecteds have a wider circle of friends and acquaintances and colleagues, some of whom they'll have quite deep and meaningful conversations with and relationships with. And some might be more superficial, but the reality is the connected introvert enjoys the variety of connections. So they might have much wider circle than just the acquaintances on one hand that the classic introvert has. Ironically, they're very popular and well known because they're connected. They tend to have quite a powerful personal brand, and they quite enjoy group interaction and that to and fro of social chatter, which many introverts really can't imagine. And they quite enjoy the larger and livelier get-togethers because they enjoy that rapport building and those kind of conversations. They will use a network quite strategically. So they may have a plan about actually who they need to connect to get something done, who they need to call on to get something done. In a later show, we'll talk about the importance of having a really robust support network. And the connected introvert is a master of that, because they know exactly who they need on side at any one time. And because they are quite good at connecting different people, and they have this reputation, this brand, and are quite good at social interaction, people build rapport with them quite easily. It's relatively easy to feel like you get connected with a connected introvert. So I wonder how many of you watching will begin to think, actually, I can see some of myself in that. And so some of these introvert groups that are all about introverts being antisocial, the connected introvert will be going, well, that's not me, because I'm not antisocial. Let's move on then, because what we now have is the next type of introvert. And what we have is the dynamic introvert. Now, dynamics, again, are quite different, because dynamic introverts learn a bit more like a more extroverted person, because they like to get actively engaged when they socialize and when they learn. So they're an active learner. As you know, I'm a trainer, coach, and facilitator. And quite often when I'm running a course, I'll talk about us having to do what we used to call role play in the old days, and what we tend to call real play now, because we are skill practicing real situations. And the dynamic introvert, unlike the rest of the introvert types, will go, no, it's okay, I'll watch to begin with. The dynamic introvert will go, yeah, I'll give that a go, because they quite like getting involved and getting engaged in debate, as you can see from that little icon. They also like to see people face to face. So whereas many introverts haven't enjoyed lockdown and having to be on camera, the dynamic introvert are quite happy to see people face to face, because actually that face to face interaction gives them precious clues that they need in order to understand what's really going on with someone, because they are a good reader of facial expression. They're a good reader of body language. So it's really important that they get to see people's faces. Unlike many of the other introvert types, a dynamic introvert may well offer to take the lead in a new situation, in a new group. Again, something many people would say, oh, introverts would never do that. So you can start to detect from these extroverted introvert types, sometimes people say, no, you're not an introvert, because when they see people step up and take the lead, they'll say, no, an introvert wouldn't do that. So again, more myths that we need to dispel. And the interesting thing, having said that most introverts have this say, think, say communication process, dynamic introvert doesn't always think everything through. They're more happy to go with the flow, a bit more like the extrovert does. So they're not always attached to what they're saying. They're not always completely bought in yet to what they're saying. So what are the real strengths that a dynamic introvert brings to a situation? Well, they'll step up to the plate. They'll take the lead. They will engage in that debate. They will actually make eye contact, something that many people think a shy introvert won't do. But we know shyness and introversion, two different things. So the dynamic introvert brings an energy to a situation that is much needed. And when we have dynamic introverts in our teams, or dynamic introverts who are our leaders and managers, there's an energy there that actually can be quite contagious. You know, we know attitude is contagious, so is energy. So that's the first few. Let's move on to think about the next type of introvert we're looking at. And the next type is the engaging introvert. Now, the engaging introvert is definitely one of those that people will say, no, you're not an introvert. Because the engaging introvert, as the icon shows, are magic on a stage. Some of you know that I did a TEDx talk in 2019. And when I was sharing my topic with some of my fellow speakers, one or two of them said, "Oh, that's really interesting because I'm an introvert too." And some of those were the best on that stage at the time. Because there's something about an introvert's thought process generally, unless you're a dynamic introvert, that means that everything is structured and everything is thought through and everything is well considered. So when you're delivering it from a platform, from a stage, it's easy to follow. So let's look at some of those positive qualities. The engaging introvert brings this lively, excitable energy. They can get a crowd really interested and excited. Think about some of the engaging introverts that we're aware of who take to the platform very well. Simon Sinek being one of them. You know, he's really good at getting people to follow his line of thought, to follow his story, because one of the other things about the engaging introvert is that they are really good storytellers and their verbal exchanges are stimulating. So when they actually get into conversation with us, we're more likely to have those generative conversations that really move our thinking on. Their enthusiasm is infectious. You can't help but be brought along, but be swept along by it. And again, that's why a lot of people will say, surely you're not an introvert. But the engaging introvert brings this very special quality that we need in business, we need in leadership. Not all the time, because the other thing about the engaging introvert is they know when to kind of turn it down a bit and when to turn it up a bit, and that's within their capability. They're very animated when they communicate. So they're likely to move a lot, to gesture a lot, to use their facial expressions a lot, all of which will bring a story to life. And the other thing they're really good at doing is bringing about stimulating laughter when things get a bit too serious. So they may not be a natural joke teller, but the one thing introverts are renowned for is being able to laugh at themselves, especially this engaging introvert. So some of the best comedians who either observe behavior and tell it beautifully or tell stories about themselves are likely to be those engaging introverts. So we definitely need those. We definitely need the engaging introverts to play to their strengths. But you can imagine that this kind of energy, whilst they can do it without it draining their batteries, they still need to pre-charge to make sure there's enough charge to bring this lively energy to the fore. And they need to recharge afterwards, because all of these extroverted introvert types still share that one common bond of what drains them and what charges them is often that solo activity, that quiet time, that alone time. One of the things we'll know about an engaging introvert is even if they've given a terrific platform speech, conference speech, lecture, whatever it is they happen to have done, when they're done, they will away and they will take themselves off for their recharge. They probably won't walk down through the aisles of the audience high-fiving everyone, because actually they bring that energy to the stage and to some interactions, but it's not there all the time like an extrovert. The other thing about the engaging introvert is that they seem to have a knack of knowing what's going on. It's like they've got their finger on the pulse. So they're happy to be the center of attention from time to time, and their energy acts like a magnet and it draws us like a moth to them because that energy is contagious. Where do we go next? Well, next we go to my type of introversion. So the next type is this open introvert. And as you can see from the icon, this is somebody, an introvert type that's much more used to and happy to share a bit more like an extrovert would. There won't be oversharing, of that I can guarantee. But what they are able to do is share their thoughts and feelings openly. So they are really able to, when somebody says to an open introvert, how are you? When somebody asks me, how are you, Joe? They better mean the question, because I'm likely to tell them. And if they didn't want to know, they'll hear something they didn't want to hear. We're quite easy to get to know as open introverts because we do share. And especially once we have that sense of trust with people. Now, what's interesting is other open introverts, a bit like me, tend to have more trust to start with, whereas some people, trust has to be built. An open introvert, it's more likely that there is trust initially, but if you break that trust, you will have really destroyed things. It will take a long time to build back up again. Open introverts, be ready, because we're prepared to discuss the undiscussable. I think it's quite useful for me to have this open introversion as my style when I'm facilitating groups, because being the introvert I am observing, I notice what's not being said as well as what's being said. And I will raise and talk about the undiscussable. I will name the elephant in the room, which is often what needs to happen in groups, but a lot of people aren't prepared to do that. I say we're refreshingly open and honest. We rarely, if ever, will delude or put spin on things. We won't deceive people. So we will speak our truth. And sometimes people don't want to hear that. What is important for an open introvert is this two-way communication. Because trust is important to us, because we share and prepared to show some of our vulnerability, we need to see that back from somebody else. So ironically, we find really closed people quite hard to get on with, because that two-way communication is so important for us. So where do open introverts really come into their own? Well, I've talked about it in terms of a facilitation role. Again, as managers and leaders, being prepared to be vulnerable, to show humility, is something that's incredibly important to do. So rather than hiding it, be prepared to talk about how we're feeling, encourage other people to talk about how they are feeling too. You know, one of the phrases we hear a lot about at the moment is psychological safety, where it's okay for people to share what they're thinking and feeling without fear of retribution, without fear of ridicule. An open introvert is the brilliant facilitator to make and to build that psychological safety, so they can be really valuable. One more to go of the pure introvert types, the pure extroverted introvert types, and that's the sociable introvert. Now, if ever there was an introvert type that people said, you're having me on, you're not an introvert, it's our sociable introvert. Because the sociable introvert, as again you can see from that icon, is happy in small groups, as many of the rest of us are, and is also happy in large groups. So they are people who will actually be quite good at the small talk, quite good again at the networking, and really good at mixing with new people. They're competent networkers, where we heard the connected introvert will use their network strategically. The sociable introvert is someone who is more of a natural networker, something we don't often come across actually with people in the introvert world. Although Matthew Pollard, who has written a lot about the Introvert Edge Guide to Networking, will actually say that introverts are brilliant networkers. So find out a little bit more about his work too. We're happy to mingle and introduce people. So we will see kind of who needs introducing. So as introverts, if we're at a networking event, we're likely to spot the introvert who's on the sidelines, who doesn't know quite how to get involved. And we'll be the ones who'll probably go over, start a one-to-one conversation with them because we're good in those small situations, and then bring them into the crowd if that's what they want to do. So we're good at this mingling thing. We may even chat to strangers. In fact, even though a sociable introvert is not quite my style, I'm somebody who chats to people in queues. I was in the queue for at the post office a few weeks ago, and found myself talking to the person behind me and in front of me and the person behind me. And we were talking about what we were doing with the things that we had in our arms at the time, because we had post office work to do, but also shopping. And I made a joke because the man in front of me had a bottle of wine and the man behind me had chocolates. So I suggested, how brash of me, that actually it sounded like maybe the three of us should get together. Didn't want to take that one too far, but that's the sort of thing that a sociable introvert would do. What we are is more likely to show up if we've accepted an invitation. We will consider each and every one of those invitations, and we're more likely as a sociable introvert to decline rather than to accept, because we don't want to cause conflict. What we're more likely to say is, well, that sounds interesting, but I really don't know that I have the capacity to do that. So a sociable introvert, if they've accepted, much more likely to show up. Where do we need those sociable introverts? Anywhere in the workplace, because they bridge in a way between the extrovert world and the introvert world, and make it possible for us all to live kind of somewhat harmoniously in the workplace. So they are the 6 introvert types. And maybe you're thinking now, I wonder what type I am. Well, there's one way to find out, and that's to complete the introvert questionnaire that you'll find at this address, www.yourintroverttype.co.uk. Just a few questions will help you understand which of those is your type. Now, I've talked about the 6 types, but it could be when you complete your questionnaire, you might be a classic, but you might also be a connected, open, sociable introvert. And once we get into those blends where 2 or 3 of those extroverted introvert types are who we are, people rarely believe that we're an introvert. So we'll need to do more work to help them understand what we need to do to put our boundaries in place so that we can recharge when necessary. So I'm thinking that my next show could well be about how we put in place boundaries as an introvert, so that what we can do is make sure that whatever type of introvert we are, especially if we're one of those blends, so 2 or 3 or even 4 of the extroverted introvert types all in one, that we find a way to communicate that to people so that we get exactly what we need, so that we get that downtime, so that we can recharge our batteries as we need. So I really appreciate you showing up. I'm glad you came in and made yourself at home. And I'm be delighted to welcome you back next week, when what we'll talk about is boundaries. So thank you for your time.